Ilara gripped the splintered handle of the ladle, the iron pot of beans her only anchor in a world that had tilted off its axis. She was 20, a widow, and now she was the cook for 20 rough men driving 2,000 head of longhorn cattle north from Texas. It was the only work a woman like her could find. A woman with no family left to take her in, no land to her name, and a face too plain to attract a second husband. The first had been a kindness, a brief shelter before consumption took him and left her with nothing but his name and a dress worn thin at the elbows. So she cooked. She rose before the sun bled color into the sky, her hands raw from kneading sourdough in the chill morning air. She wrestled with the heavy Dutch ovens, her face perpetually smudged with soot. She served slabs of bacon and poured rivers of black coffee into tin cups held by hands that were calloused, dirty, and sometimes cruel. The men called her Cookie, or sometimes just the woman. They rarely used her name. To them, she was a function, a pair of hands that turned flour and salt pork into fuel. She existed in the periphery of their world, a silent, necessary shadow by the chuck wagon. She preferred it that way. Silence was a shield. Anonymity was armor. She kept her eyes down, her voice low, and her heart locked away in a place so deep the dust of the trail could never reach it. The trail boss was Silas Blackwood. He was a wall of a man, carved from the same hard rock and unforgiving sun as the land itself. His face was a map of harsh lines, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and his voice was a low rumble that could soothe a spooked horse or stop a charging steer. He moved with a quiet authority that needed no shouting. The men, even the meanest of them, respected him, feared him a little. He had hired her in dusty San Angelo, his gaze sweeping over her once, assessing and dismissive. He had not asked about her husband. He had not offered condolences. "Can you cook for 20 men from here to Kansas?" he had asked. His voice was rough, like dry wood. "I can," she had answered, her own voice barely a whisper. "The work is hard. The men are harder. You'll get no special treatment. I don't expect any." He had nodded, a short, sharp motion. The deal was done. From his saddle, Silas watched her. He did it often, when he rode back to check on the wagon, or in the evenings when the men were gathered around the fire she had built. He told himself he was just ensuring the cook was holding up. A weak link could slow the whole drive down. But it was more than that. He watched the way she moved with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. He watched her hands, chapped and red, but steady as she portioned out the food, giving every man an equal share. He saw the pride in the straight line of her back as she scrubbed the pots long after the others were asleep. He had 2 children back at his ranch in Montana, a boy, Caleb, of 8, and a girl, Rose, of 6. They were wild things, growing up without a mother's touch for 2 long years. His late wife, Mary, had been soft and full of laughter. The house had fallen silent after she was gone, a deep, hollow silence that even the children's shouting could not fill. He needed a wife, not for himself. He had closed that part of his heart when he had shoveled the last spade of dirt onto Mary's grave. He needed a mother for his children, a woman of substance, a woman of strength, not some fragile belle who would wither under the harsh Montana sky. He had seen women in town, pretty things with soft hands and empty eyes, their parents eager to marry them off to a man of his standing. He had seen the greed in their fathers' faces, the ambition in their own. They wanted his land, his name. They did not want his wild, grieving children. So he watched the widow, the plain, quiet cook. He saw things the other men did not. He saw the way she saved a small piece of dried apple for the youngest wrangler, a boy barely 17 who sometimes looked like he was about to cry from homesickness. He saw her stitch a torn shirt for another man, leaving it folded neatly on his bedroll without a word. He saw her character, and it was a thing of rare and sturdy beauty. The first test came a week into the drive. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled across the plains, turning the dust to thick, clinging mud. The sky opened up, rain lashing down in sheets, and the cattle grew restless. The men were soaked, miserable, and short-tempered. The firewood was drenched. "No hot coffee tonight, boys," one of the men, a surly cowboy named Jeb, grumbled, kicking at a wet log, and probably cold beans. The men groaned in collective misery. A hot meal was the one comfort they had at the end of a long, hard day. Silas watched Elara. She said nothing. Her face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was calm. She simply pulled a spare tarp over the chuckwagon stores, securing them tightly. Then, using the dry kindling she always kept in a sealed box under the driver's seat and shielding it with her own body, she managed to coax a small, sputtering flame to life in the sheltered lee of the wagon. It was not a roaring bonfire, but it was enough. An hour later, the smell of hot coffee cut through the damp air. She had heated it over her tiny, precious fire. And the beans were hot, too, simmered in the Dutch oven nestled in the coals. She did not complain. She did not look for praise. She simply did the work. Silas took his tin cup and plate. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. They were gray, he noticed. Not dull, but the color of river stones, deep and steady. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, meant only for her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to her pots, but Silas saw the faint flush that rose on her cheeks. He had breached the wall of her silence, if only for a moment. From that day on, he began to make small gestures. He made sure his bedroll was placed to windward of hers, offering a slight break from the relentless prairie wind. When they crossed a shallow creek, he dismounted and wordlessly offered a hand to help her down from the wagon, his grip firm and steady on her arm. He started bringing her the first cup of coffee in the morning, taking it from the pot himself instead of waiting for her to serve him. He never said a word about it, neither did she. But she noticed. Elara felt his eyes on her. At first it had made her uneasy, another man's gaze to be endured. But his was different. It was not the leering look some of the younger cowboys gave her, nor the dismissive glance of the others. It was watchful, appraising, but there was something else in it too, something that looked like respect. It was a foreign feeling. She started to notice things about him too, the way he always took the last watch of the night, giving his men more rest, the gentleness in his hands when he treated a calf with a broken leg, the lines of weariness around his eyes that spoke of a burden heavier than just 2,000 cattle. One evening, a quiet fell over the camp. The cattle were settled, the sky a deep star-dusted indigo. Elara was cleaning up, her movement slow with fatigue. Silas approached the fire, holding a small piece of wood and a knife. He sat on a log, not too close to her, but within the circle of light. He began to carve. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising dexterity, peeling away thin curls of wood. He was not carving a toy or an animal, but shaping a handle. He worked in silence for a long time, the only sound the scrape of the blade and the crackle of the fire. When he was finished, he had fashioned a new, smooth handle for her largest stew pot, the old one of which was cracked and splintered. He stood, walked over to the wagon where she was working, and set it down on the tailgate beside her. He did not speak. He just met her gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his bedroll. Elara picked up the handle. It was smooth and warm from his hands. It fit her palm perfectly. She ran her thumb over the flawless grain of the wood. A strange, tight feeling gathered in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had done something for her. A simple, unspoken act of kindness. She looked over at his sleeping form, a dark shape under the vast, starry sky. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The thaw continued, slow and almost invisible, like the first hint of green after a long winter. She found herself saving him the choicest cut of meat, making sure his coffee was just the way he liked it, strong and black. She mended a tear in his heavy duster, the needle moving deftly through the thick canvas. One night, Jeb, the cowboy with the mean streak, had too much whiskey from a hidden flask. He stumbled over to the chuck wagon where Elara was packing away the last of the supplies. "Hey, Cookie," he slurred, leaning unsteadily against the wagon wheel. "You're a lonely woman out here, ain't you? A pretty little widow like you." Elara ignored him, her back stiffening. He reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't be like that. I'm just being friendly." "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and cold. Before Jeb could respond, a shadow fell over them. Silas was there. He had moved without a sound. "She told you to let go," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it had the deadly quiet of a coiled snake. Jeb's drunken bravado evaporated. He snatched his hand back as if burned. "Just talking, boss. You will not talk to her again," Silas stated. It was not a warning. It was a fact, unless it's to ask for your food. And then you will say please and thank you. Do you understand me? "Yes, boss," Jeb mumbled, his eyes on the ground. "Go to your bedroll. You're off first watch." Jeb scurried away into the darkness. Silas turned to Elara. The firelight flickered across the hard planes of his face. His stormy eyes searched hers. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I am." He stood there for a moment longer, a silent guardian. "He won't bother you again." Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows to take Jeb's place on watch. Elara leaned against the wagon, her legs feeling weak. He had defended her. Publicly, he had drawn a line in the sand and placed her on his side of it. She was not just the cook to him, she was a woman under his protection. The knowledge settled deep inside her, a small, warm coal in the cold emptiness of her chest. The days bled into weeks. The landscape changed from the scrub of Texas to the rolling grasslands of Kansas. The work was relentless, a monotonous cycle of dust and sun and endless lowing. But something had shifted between Elara and Silas. An invisible thread now connected them, woven from shared glances, silent favors, and a mutual, unspoken respect. He started talking to her, in the quiet moments after the men had eaten. He told her about his ranch in Montana, describing the towering mountains and the clear, cold rivers. He spoke of his children, his voice softening in a way she had never heard before. "Caleb is a serious boy," he said one evening, staring into the fire. "He feels things deeply. Too much like me." He paused. "And Rose, she's all fire and light, like her mother was." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. Elara listened, her hands busy mending a flour sack. She did not offer platitudes or sympathy. She simply gave him the gift of her quiet attention. "It's hard, raising them alone," he admitted, the words seeming to be pulled from a great depth. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." He looked at her then, a real look, one that saw past the soot and the plain dress to the woman beneath. He saw the memory of her own loss in her steady gray eyes. They were two solitary figures bound by a grief they did not speak of, but understood completely. The great external threat came when they were less than a week from their destination. It began with a strange smell on the wind, acrid and sharp. Then a dark plume of smoke appeared on the horizon, growing larger and blacker with terrifying speed. A prairie fire. Panic rippled through the herd. The cattle grew agitated, their lowing turning to bellows of fear. Stampede. Someone shouted. The world erupted into chaos. The ground thundered with the sound of thousands of hooves. The air filled with dust and panicked shouts. The fire was a roaring orange beast, devouring the dry grass and racing toward them. Silas was a whirlwind of motion, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the din. Turn them toward the river, now. The cowboys spurred their horses, trying desperately to head off the terrified herd and steer them toward the safety of the nearby river. Elara's world was the chuck wagon, the mules pulling at Braid in terror, their eyes wide. She grabbed the reins, her knuckles white. She could try to outrun the fire, but the heavy wagon was slow. Or she could try to get to the river, but she risked being caught in the path of the stampede. She saw a spark land on the canvas cover of the wagon. In an instant, a small flame appeared. The wagon was full of supplies, flour, bacon fat, gunpowder. It was a bomb on wheels. Without a second thought, she scrambled onto the top of the lurching wagon. Clinging on with one hand, she used her heavy skirt to beat at the flames. The fire was hot, searing. It caught the hem of her dress. She smothered it against the canvas, wincing as the heat scorched her leg. She saw Silas fighting to control the herd. His horse stumbled, going down in a tangle of legs. Silas was thrown, landing hard. He lay stunned, directly in the path of a smaller group of cattle that had broken away from the main herd. They were charging blindly, their eyes wild with terror. He was going to be trampled. There was no time to think. Elara grabbed the heavy bullwhip that hung from the side of the wagon. She had never used one before, but she had watched the drovers. She leaped from the wagon, landing hard but rolling to her feet. She ran toward Silas, placing herself between him and the charging animals. She raised the whip and cracked it in the air. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. "Ha! Get back!" she screamed, her voice raw. The lead steer, surprised by the sudden noise and the small, fierce figure in its path, hesitated. It veered to the side. The others followed, splitting around her and the fallen man. They thundered past, their horns like a thicket of knives, their bodies a wall of muscle and fear. Dust and pebbles kicked up, stinging her face. And then they were gone. Silence descended, broken only by the roar of the distant fire and the pounding of her own heart. Silas pushed himself up on his elbows, his head ringing. He had seen it all. He had seen her on the wagon, beating out the fire. He had seen her jump down. He had seen her stand before 2 tons of stampeding beef to save his life. She stood there, trembling, the whip hanging limply from her hand. Her face was black with soot, her dress was singed, and there was a wild, courageous light in her eyes. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. He got to his feet, his body aching, and walked toward her. He stopped in front of her, looking down at the small, fierce woman who had just saved him. The respect he felt for her transformed in that moment, crystallizing into something deep, powerful, and undeniable. It was admiration. It was awe. It was love. He reached out and gently took the whip from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. "Elara," he said, using her name. It sounded like a prayer. Her composure finally broke. A shudder ran through her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and grounding. "You're safe," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. The rest of the cowboys managed to push the herd into the river, where the fire could not reach them. The danger had passed. The aftermath was a scene of quiet devastation. The prairie was a blackened, smoking ruin. The men were exhausted, their faces grim. But they were alive. The herd was mostly intact, and the chuck wagon, thanks to Ilara, was safe. That night, the camp was subdued. It was the last night of the drive. Tomorrow, they would reach Abilene. The men spoke in low murmurs, their usual boisterous energy gone, replaced by a weary gratitude. Ilara tended to Silas's bruised ribs, her touch gentle as she applied a salve. They worked in the intimate quiet of the firelight, the rest of the camp a blur around them. "I didn't expect this," he said, his voice low. He wasn't talking about the fire. "The trail is full of surprises," she replied, her eyes focused on her task. "You are full of surprises, Ilara," he corrected softly. She finished her work and made to pull away, but he caught her hand. His grip was gentle. He held it, turning it over to look at her palm, calloused and scarred from her work. "Tomorrow, these men will be paid," he said. "They will go their separate ways. And you will be free to go yours." Her heart gave a painful lurch. Of course. The job was over. She would take her pay and be alone again. The thought, which once would have meant safety, now felt like a desolate emptiness. "I have a ranch in Montana," he continued, his thumb tracing a line on her palm. "I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. They need a mother." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unable to speak. "This journey for me, it was not just about the cattle," he confessed, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I was looking for someone, a woman of strength, of character, of kindness, a woman who would not break." He paused, his stormy eyes holding hers. "I found her." I don't understand," she whispered. "I am asking you to marry me, Ilara, to come home with me, to be my wife, and a mother to my children." It was not a declaration of love in the way the poets wrote about. It was something deeper, more real. It was a proposal built on a foundation of respect, forged in hardship and fire. It was a statement of need, of recognition. A snort of derisive laughter cut through the quiet. It was Jeb. He had been listening. Her? He sneered, loud enough for the whole camp to hear. "You're asking the cook to be your wife? The plain little mousy cook?" Every head turned. The men stared, their faces a mixture of shock and cruel amusement. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She tried to pull her hand from Silas's, to shrink back into the shadows where she belonged. He did not let her go. His grip tightened, a silent message of reassurance. He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet beside him. He did not look at Jeb. He looked at all of his men, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and hard as granite. The public stage was the flickering circle of the last campfire. "This woman," Silas began, his voice ringing with a power that commanded absolute silence, "is named Ilara. And you will use her name when you speak of her." He let that sink in. "You call her the cook," he went on, his voice low and fierce. "I have watched her for 2 months. I watched her work from before sunrise to after midnight without a single word of complaint. I watched her give every man here an equal share, even when some of you didn't deserve it. I watched her manage our supplies with a wisdom that saved us more than once." He looked directly at Jeb. "I watched her face down your drunken foolishness with a dignity you will never possess." His gaze moved back to the other men. "And today," he said, his voice rising, "I watched her save this entire drive. I watched her beat back a fire on a wagon full of gunpowder with her own skirt. And then I watched her stand, alone, with nothing but a whip in her hand. between me and a stampede." He paused, his hand still holding Alara's tightly. "She is not plain. She is forged from iron and courage. She is not a mousy cook. She is the strongest person I have ever known. She is more of a woman than any of you will ever have the honor of meeting." The silence was absolute. The men stared, their mockery gone, replaced by a dawning, grudging respect. They had seen it too, they just hadn't understood what they were looking at. "She will be my wife," Silas declared, his voice softening as he turned his gaze to Alara. "She will be the lady of my ranch, and she will be the mother of my children, and any man who shows her anything less than the utmost respect will answer directly to me." He looked back at the assembled crew. "Do I make myself clear?" A chorus of yes, boss, and respectful nods rippled through the men. Jeb stared at his boots, his face red with shame. The community of their small, temporary world had passed its judgment. They had validated her. Silas turned his full attention back to Alara. The firelight danced in his eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a stoic trail boss, but a man whose heart was as vast and untamed as the land he called home, and he was offering her a place in it. "I am not asking you to be a servant, Alara," he said, his voice now gentle, for her alone. "I am asking you to be my partner, to build a life with me, to bring the light back to my home." He hesitated, a vulnerability creeping into his tone that she had never heard before. "I need you." No one had ever needed her, not really. She had been a convenience, a duty, a temporary solution. But this man, this strong, honorable, powerful man, was looking at her as if she were the answer to a prayer he had been afraid to speak aloud. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She stood a little taller. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, Silas, I will." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features. It was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It was a promise, a beginning. The journey to Montana was different. She no longer rode in the chuck wagon. She rode on a gentle mare beside him. They were no longer boss and cook. They were a future. The ranch was even more beautiful than he had described. A sturdy log house sat nestled in a valley, with snow-capped peaks rising like silent giants in the distance. And then there were the children. Caleb, the boy, stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his 8-year-old face a perfect miniature copy of his father's stoic mask. Rose, the girl, hid behind his legs, peering out with wide, suspicious eyes. They were the untamed hearts, the real test. Alara did not rush them. She did not try to replace their mother. She simply began to build a home around them. She cooked warm meals that filled the silent house with the scent of cinnamon and baking bread. She mended their clothes. She read to them in the evenings by the fire, her voice soft and even. Caleb tested her constantly, with sullen silences and small acts of rebellion. Rose simply watched her, a tiny, silent judge. The breakthrough came a month later. A late autumn snowstorm blew in, trapping them in the house. Caleb came down with a fever, his body racked with coughs. He cried out in his delirium, calling for his mother. Alara sat by his bed for 2 days and 2 nights. She bathed his forehead with cool water. She spooned broth between his lips. She held his hand and hummed old, forgotten lullabies. Silas watched from the doorway, his heart aching with a mixture of old grief and new hope. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Caleb woke, his eyes clear. He looked at Alara, who was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped in exhaustion. He reached out a small hand and touched her arm. She woke with a start. "I'm thirsty," he whispered. She gave him a small, tired smile and fetched him a cup of water, holding it while he drank. Later that day, Rose approached Ilara as she sat knitting by the fire. The little girl held out a small, clumsily made doll of yarn. She placed it in Ilara's lap. "For you," she mumbled, and then, before Ilara could respond, she climbed up into her lap, curled into a small ball, and fell asleep. Ilara looked at Silas over the top of the child's head. His eyes were shining with an emotion so profound it needed no words. The children had accepted her. Her quiet strength, her relentless patience, had won them over. A year later, the ranch was thriving. The silence in the house had been replaced by the sound of children's laughter. Ilara stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of rose and gold. She was no longer the thin, haunted widow from the cattle trail. Her face had a soft fullness, and her eyes held a deep, quiet contentment. Caleb and Rose were playing in the yard, their shouts echoing in the clear mountain air. A small, round-faced baby named Hope slept peacefully in a cradle just inside the door. Silas came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they watched their children. "I love you, Ilara," he said, the words no longer a confession of need, but a simple, powerful truth. She leaned back against his solid strength, her hand covering his. She did not need to say the words back. He could feel it in her touch, see it in the peaceful lines of her face, and hear it in the happy sounds of the family she had built. She was just the cook. He was just the boss, until a prairie fire and a public declaration revealed what their hearts had known all along. They were two halves of a whole, a quiet strength and a steady protector, finally home. The love between them was not a roaring blaze, but a warm, enduring hearth, built to last a lifetime against the cold.